This is the Swiss Degen by Todd Cutler. Beautiful little piece. Is it a sword? Is it a dagger? Nobody knows. This style of sword slash dagger was very popular between about the 14th and 15th century for pretty much any soldier. This, again, fills one of those requirements that all armies have had for all of history when their primary weapon is something like a spear or a pike. The secondary weapon is almost always some kind of short, small sword thing. Now, why did this type of a sword even exist? I mean, we are in the period of arming swords. This is a Royal Armouries 1 review coming soon. And even some kind of long swords that were still being carried on the battlefield. Sterling Armory. That'll be having a review soon. And a lot of these style of swords were contemporary. Now, this style of sword that we're wearing right here seems to be a little bit odd, a little bit out of place. You can see our handguard is non-substantial, and our butt plate is non-substantial, and it's literally just a piece of wood right there. So, why did this type of a sword exist? Well, firstly, this is a super convenient little tiny sword. Now, these are somewhere between dagger length, which is more of that size, and more full sword length, more of like this size. A lot of these were carried as secondary weapons, again, by pikemen. These were popularized by both the Swiss and the German. Most popular with like the Swiss formation, I think they're called Gewaltwaffen, pike squares. We'd have 5 or 6 rows of men holding big pikes, stabbing up and at people. A lot of these guys would never really close past, this distance. But as soon as the pikes went up, the clash got close, you'd have to be able to draw your sword to be able to do damage to the enemy. These type of swords, like I said, have existed all the way back since really the first earliest styles of sword had a hilt very similar to this. You can see it's very beautiful right here. I've dyed mine black because black is a good color. Mine, I've really smacked the crap of. And you can see all of those little trace marks in there. That was me testing the hardness of the steel. And it looks like this steel is really quite tough. It holds a razor edge. You can see I've kind of scuffed it up quite a bit that I'll likely polish out later. Maybe I won't, just because I kind of like that rough look. Polished this by stone and with a grindstone to kind of set the edge. This is made again by Todd Cutler. There's his little insignia right there that he puts on all of his weapons. And originally when I bought this sword, I thought it would be kind of a cheap, middle of the line, EN45 crappy steel. But it turns out this is actually super high quality. Now, the only thing that was wrong with mine is if you look there at the top, we have a little bit of a gap there. That wasn't there when it was originally. After the sword dried out in the winter time, with the furnace running, it looks like that has somewhat separated. The pommel cap has not been loosened at all, but it does look like that is something to worry about in the future. This was originally painted black, but I've done a lot of handling with this, and the paint kind of rubs off over time. Really not that big of a deal. It's still really, really handy. Now, this style of sword, like I said, was used almost exclusively as a secondary weapon, so not usually drawn during battle. You'd be sitting here in your pike formation, doing damage to your enemy. If that, for whatever reason, it closed, a knight fell down in front of you, you'd be able to pull this out and be able to get a little bit more in the thick of things. Now, this type of sword was used very commonly with sword and buckler right here. I imagine kind of the same era, so you can use the buckler for a lot of hand protection, especially if you're something like an archer or a billman or a pikeman. You may always be carrying one of these on here. A lot of these had a strap that would mount right there next to the sword. You could just kind of handily walk away. If your main weapon got lost, the bow, the arquebus, the pike, you'd be able to draw these and still become an effective fighting force. Now, these were also used in civilian life. You can see just having a cute little handy sword in the event of attacking somewhere where you can't move a pike around, or in a street brawl, or doing any kind of things that you see gangbangers nowadays doing. Might be more useful to have a more handy weapon. Alrighty, congratulations. You are now a pike man. You have a massive spear and a tiny dagger, maybe a buckler of some sort. But we have just come face to face. We were at one of the more major battles during the pike and shot era. My spear, my pike, has been dropped. Where the front ranks, both ranks have come together. Pikes are shot up, so your pike is starting to move up like that. I drop my pike now that we're in a bit closer, and I draw my secondary. That can be a dagger like this, a Degen, a Basilard, anything like that, and I'm coming into close. Primarily on the battlefield, these guys were probably used, like I said, as secondary weapons. If you have the buckler, great, you can cover and make all kinds of offending actions at your opponent. Now, you're not going to be able to cut as well with this as with something like an arming sword, one of these bad boys over here, or a longsword. But now that we are super close, this is a little tiny maneuverable thing. I can do all kinds of super nimble work. I can thrust, I can stab, I can cover if I have a buckler. If not, I have my hand. Again, like we saw during that the greatest sword or most powerful sword ever video, I can cover the pike, be able to thrust in with there. I can make tiny cuts in to cover the pike, make sure it can't come back, grab the half of it, and do some stabbing. Very, very maneuverable little tiny weapon. I imagine these were used almost exclusively with that section of the blade at the very tip. You don't need a ton of penetrative power to be able to disable an opponent. You can hack into somebody's arm, cut it down all the way to bone. Some people may still be able to use their hand. If you stick that in, I think crime statistics say about 3 inches is enough to be fatal. So if I can stick this point into somewhere vulnerable, from right here, neck, I can hit into the hands, slide in and do a cut or a stab at my opponent. We can do all kinds of really, really nasty things. I prefer to use it with a buckler if I had one, just because we are missing that hand protection. But again, without hand protection, we have more of an availability to move my hand around. It's less likely to get tied up against my spear when we're in a deep formation, swinging back and forth. We also have much more of an ability to weave super tightly around the buckler. So say they're swinging the spear in at me, I can cover, whoop, bring that back, I can cover on this side with my buckler, pushing that out with my buckler rim, and I can offend that way, going in for the more vulnerable points. Sometimes, especially if you're in the front rank, as a pikeman, you'll be wearing some type of a helmet with a small crosspiece here. So I do have to be somewhat accurate with this. So it does treat you well to have a little nimble sword. One of the reasons I believe that these weren't used, well, that these were used instead of using something like a longsword, is let's set up the same situation. I am a knight. I have been dismounted for some reason, maybe because I'm English and fighting the right way, or maybe I'm French and my horse has been cut out from under me. So I have my nice, beautiful longsword. I am closing. I'm super close right here. Your spear has about the same length as mine, even if you've choked up back over in here. I'm significantly less maneuverable at this distance than my opponent would be if they had something like a dagger. So something like this is definitely a lot less useful at punching range. If I can touch my opponent, I have to do all kinds of crazy things with my sword, be able to get in close enough. I have just this little tiny window of things that I can do. And again, my hand is still quite vulnerable, even with this. Now, an arming sword is a little bit closer to what would be awesome. So I have my arming sword. I've drawn it out of my sheath. Again, because the sword is longer, I have to take a really far distance. Where with my Degen, I can slip out just with the length of the blade. So the difference between my hip and my shoulder, I can pull this out fairly easily and have it engage without having to draw across my body. With something like the arming sword, if it's in a similar position, I can't get it out of the scabbard. So it has to be a certain length, and this is pretty much the maximum of what you'd want. So draw that out, and now I have a scabbard, or I have a sword out of the scabbard. I have a little bit better hand protection, so I can do similar things. But again, I'm still so close past this point that it's going to be really hard for me to engage as effectively. Again, I'd probably end up having to do some kind of a half sword thing, and then we're in the same position as the long sword. So I don't have nearly as much, and I don't have a hand free to be able to do what we need to. So in general, I believe that swords like the Degen existed because other stuff is way too long. Especially if I am a peasant soldier or I've just been recruited, I'm not being paid a whole ton of money, and I have to provide my own equipment. So this would be substantially cheaper than something like an arming sword would be, which is more steel, takes more skill to make, or even something like a long sword, which people can train for their entire life, write manuals about, and everything like that. These are going to be so much more expensive to use than something like this. And this, I would argue, requires significantly more training to use effectively than something like this up close. And we can see this in later periods when they develop things like the messer, which is contemporary with this, the rapier. They start to evolve as time goes to going shorter and shorter swords, and then they fit in a category pretty much very similar to something like this. Now this sword, some people treat it as a dagger. I would argue that it's not really super effective like this because it is just too long. If we think of earlier like rondel daggers, they're like this long. Those are for seeking gaps in super heavily armored enemies. In the battlefields where these were being used, it was not super common to face a fully armored soldier. They did exist. You have things like the Doppelsoldners, but many of them, as they evolved in time period, they evolved things called demi-plate, or half-plate. You'd have a breastplate and a helmet with a crossbar, probably not any pauldrons, no arm protection, just some gloves. So you can see that they have quite a bit of protection in the areas most commonly targeted by things like spears, which are less nimble than things like swords. So they can armor themselves up a little bit. It doesn't have to be full, super expensive Italian plate. It can be something more akin to just body armor, like nowadays. So as soldiers evolved, we don't fully armor soldiers anymore. We don't have face protection. We don't have back protection. We don't have leg arm protection for the most part. We have a plate and a helmet just up here. That seems to be kind of the direction that most militaries have gone. Not only is it more effective, well, not necessarily more effective, it's cheaper, and it doesn't cost nearly as much to produce for a wide array of soldiers. You can make very generic munitions grade things, and generally you're not training these men from the age of 8 until they start fighting. These men are typically trained 3 months, 6 months. I think even during the times of these massive 100 Years' War, things like that, they were trained specifically around the pike and shot era. We're looking at 2 months minimum, up to about 6 months. And I'll tag a channel by a dude named Sandroman, who has this big channel that focuses almost exclusively on pike and shot warfare, where he talks about things like this, like rapiers, like pikes, tactics, the actual history and the historiography of when these things were used. Absolutely fascinating. So I'll tag them down below. That's kind of a general look of how this looks. Alrighty, so you are still a pikeman. This is your head. As you can see, you have a massive distance on me with just the sword. So my primary goal here is going to have to be to close with my opponent. Now you can do that with your spear. You can lock over the top and see if you can sneak in a point. At this point, when all the pikes are starting to go up, we're starting to have an issue. I can't close very well out of distance from this far. You're simply just too nimble. You're going to be able to do all kinds of stuff that I just cannot defend against. I can try my best. So the first thing that I have to do is I have to be faster than my opponent. I have to close, get in close where I can make sure that that point can't offend me anymore. But once I'm past the point, really it's all mine. And because I have such a simple, nimble weapon up close, you don't need a whole ton of training to just and destroy your opponent. Now, can these cut? Absolutely. That was not a super good cut. So let's try that again. Cut right up in here. With these, you have to cut much lower on the blade. You don't have a ton of mass in this type of sword. And it's not really how thick that blade is, which is only about an inch right there. I'll show you here in a second with this longsword that has a very similar blade profile. But you don't have nearly enough leverage to make an effective cut with something like this. This sword probably only weighs like a pound. So I'll cover. I have to really make sure that my cut edge alignment is good. I have to cut down low to be able to make that effective cut. Now I've cut probably somewhere really close to a vital part of their face, eyes, neck area, something that's going to cause a lot of damage. Cut that. That's the distraction, because that's almost certainly not going to be a fatal hit. They might back off, do something crazy, but then you can really get in there, launch that point in, and make sure that you're not going to be hurt. Especially guarding against that afterblow will be massively important. Because we're assuming that you have closed so fast that your opponent can't react. So really, again, you can go into a thumb grip if you want. It's not really that big of a deal on a sword like this. If you're more comfortable with just that hammer grip, you can close that way. You can thumb grip. I have taken the edge off my opponent there. A very loose head. Taking the edge off my opponent, I can grab the shaft, staying in thumb grip, and you can cut into your opponent that direction. Again, these probably are more effective with the point, but you can use that edge, which is nice and sharp, to stick into that wooden shaft of the opponent's weapon. That will bind super strong, so they can't really swing around and get you on that side. Now again, that is the width of this blade. On something bigger, whoop, I have stabbed a leaf. On something bigger, like this, which has a very similar blade profile, up towards that tip, you can see very, very close. You have more leverage, so you can make those really quick snapping cuts much easier. Review coming soon. My opponent has their spear. Let's say we are on a one-on-one duel, so I don't have to worry about the other pikes next to him. I can really guard with false edge, guard with true edge, or even come up and do an ox guard, just like this. Step in and do that cut. And it's a lot easier because I have significantly more leverage up to the top. And a sword like this, even though it's so skinny, is a super nimble cutting weapon. I'll show you one more time. I have done my Krumpa, going into there because I'm a super well-trained German master. So good I can end my opponent before I even touch them. Whoop. I have covered my Krumpa right there. And now I can do a false edge cut or a true edge cut into my head of my opponent. Whoop. And do a little tiny cut, more effective than cutting with a dagger. So that's why daggers tend primarily to use the point. And long swords use all kinds of stuff. The spear is the queen of weapons. The long sword is king. So when using things like the dagger, you have to be super conscious that we're not going to be able to do a very effective cut. And again, with any type of dagger fighting, the key for you is to be aggressive and be faster than your opponent. So assuming we're primarily a spearman, again, spear has gone, my spear is broken, I've lost it, they have come upon me in the street, I have no spear to my name, I am in a gang and I am trying to offend the city guard. All kinds of situations where this can happen. I have drawn my Degen, either with my right or my left hand. I have it mounted on the left right now. Assuming that I was a spearman, I'd probably be holding my spear on the right. Spear goes down, sword comes out. I can cover and go super fast to my opponent. Your most aggressive action will likely give you the most success. So if I am closing with my opponent, right hand right here, I have covered, and I can make that really swift, super penetrative attack. You can really ram that all the way up into somebody. You can see how that taper is super dramatic. You're not going to meet a whole ton of resistance in the point. That can go all the way in, and then you can just slowly guide them to the floor as their water bottle head slides off your sword. But yeah, that is the Degen by Todd Cutler. An all-around great sidearm, fantasy, real life, Renaissance, all the good things. And especially if you don't want to carry around a big longsword in the stalls of your local Renaissance festival, this is a great sword to carry to both show off your status as a beautiful, wonderfully historically accurate swordsman, or to just show off. But that is the Degen. Thanks for watching.